Hey guys, it's Anna from Bright Lane Gardens, and today I'm going to walk through how I set up my hydroponics bucket systems using the DWC or deep water culture method. If you are just getting into hydroponics, if you're a beginner at all, or if you're gardening in a really small indoor space, a bucket hydroponics setup is a great option for you. These are a space-saving option. They are very basic to set up. The initial investment in these types of products is relatively inexpensive compared to other types of systems. So this is a really good beginner system. This is a really good closet system. Whatever type of setup you're looking for, typically I always recommend starting with a bucket hydroponics setup. Now, the DWC method or deep water culture simply means that the roots of your plant are just suspended in an oxygenated, nutrient-rich solution, typically used with liquid nutrients, which I will recommend a couple different varieties today. And a lot of times it's really easy to set these up in a 5 or a 3-gallon bucket. So for today's video, I'm going to walk through what types of products I like to use, how large I need my buckets to be for certain types of plants, and ultimately what my final setup will look like. Now, this video is video number 2 in a series of videos based around my hydroponic indoor garden, where I'm going to start from seed and go all the way through harvest with you guys. So if you're interested in following along as we do these videos, please hit the subscribe and alert button below. That will mean that you will be notified when the next video goes live. So starting with the basics, I of course want to start out with my bucket. This is an HTG supply bucket. I do buy directly usually from htg.com. You can also get these on various resellers such as Amazon. I love HTG's products. They all fit together, so I know that when I'm buying different components that they will fit the other systems that they have out there, and they're just a really high quality product when it comes to hydroponics. This bucket here is a 3.5 gallon bucket. A lot of people try to start out with the 5-gallon buckets, which is great because you usually have those lying around somewhere in your house. The one word of warning I have on those is it does require a lot of nutrients. So if you're growing a smaller plant like an herb or a pepper plant, it really doesn't need a 5-gallon bucket. A 3.5 gallon bucket will do just fine. And you do run the risk of kind of wasting some of your nutrients if you use a larger bucket. I usually replace my nutrient solution about once a week, which means that once a week I'll be completely dumping this bucket and starting fresh with more nutrients. So just keep that in mind as you select the size of bucket that you will use for your own setup. Next for my setup, I have the lid. Now HTG does sell an integrated net pot lid in a couple different sizes. This is the 4-banger lid, which means that 4 of these little net pots will fit right in the top there. This is excellent if you're growing some smaller plants like leafy greens or herbs. Typically, you don't need anything larger than these 4-banger lids right here. Now, if you are growing a larger plant like a large pepper or tomato plant, you'll probably want to use the 6-inch net pot, which is integrated right into this lid here. And these are actually really nice because they have a central channel here, which means your roots will fall along the outside of that channel and oxygen will actually be able to be driven up in between the roots, enabling your plant to grow huge. I mean, bigger than any other tomato plant you've ever grown. If this is your first time growing with hydroponics, you will be absolutely blown away by how large your plants can get in these types of setups. To provide oxygen to your roots, you will need some sort of air pump. This is an aquarium air pump. It is 240 gallons per hour. Now, this is a larger pump. It does have 4 output valves here, which means that I can actually power 4 buckets at the same time with this single pump. They do, of course, make much smaller pumps that will just do 1 bucket at a time. So depending on what your setup is, that's how you'll determine how large and how powerful of a pump that you will need. You will need some basic tubing. Make sure that the size of your tubing will match the size of your air pump valves as well as the size of your air stone, which I will show you next. Always make sure you overbuy on the amount of tubing that you think you will need. It just helps your system be a lot more flexible in terms of where you're going to position everything, and it's really hard to picture until you actually have it set up in your grow area. Next, you'll want an air stone. The air stone will sit at the bottom of your bucket, and this is what the air will flow through from your air pump to provide bubbles and oxygen to the roots of your plants. So this will sit at the bottom of your bucket, and it will bubble up where the roots are sitting on the top of your lid. Those are the basic components of what I need to get started with my bucket hydroponics system. So next I'm going to walk through how we're going to do this setup and where I'm going to arrange everything. This is our indoor grow space, as you can tell by the very harsh artificial lighting around me here. Now I've never grown hydroponics out here before actually, but I am going to set up a nice little station. The temperature is perfect. We keep it right around 75 degrees out here. We do a lot of propagation already. We have several fans posted around for different types of airflow, which is super beneficial when it comes to hydroponics as well. And I'll go ahead and walk you through how I'm going to set up my bucket hydroponics system out in our solarium.
So my very first step in setting up my hydroponics setup is to make sure that I have enough space to accommodate all 4 buckets that I want connected to my system. I also want to make sure that my space is relatively waterproof, as it's inevitable that there will be some water spillage at some point throughout your process. Once you have placed all of your buckets in their final locations, you'll want to get out your pump. There's a few things that we want to check for first, and that is access to a plug, and make sure that it is placed in a location that can easily reach all of the buckets you plan to connect to that single pump. Before connecting anything to your pump, you'll want to plug it in and make sure that it works on all settings. Nothing is more disappointing than getting your complete hydroponic system set up only to discover that your pump has a failure point. Once you have confirmed that your pump is in working order and have selected a final location for it to rest, you can unplug it until we're ready to test out the air stones. Next, you'll unpackage your air stones. One air stone will be placed in the bottom of each bucket to provide oxygen to all the plants located in that bucket's lid. Now we'll get to work on our tubing. The tubing you select should be rigid enough that you can easily fit it over the fittings for your air pump and your air stones. However, you do want it to be pliable enough that it can bend over the edge of a bucket without impacting the amount of air that can flow through that tube. Your tubing should have a very snug fit around your air stone's valve. This will give it an airtight connection while allowing air to flow easily through the tube and into the air stone. Next, you will want to start measuring out how much tubing you need to connect each bucket's air stone to the central pump. Make sure you have all of your buckets and your air pump in their final locations prior to cutting any tubing. I like to loosely measure the distance from the air pump to the bottom of my buckets using the actual tubing. Then I add another 2 to 3 inches for some flexibility in my setup, in case I want to move things around later on. Once you have measured the appropriate distance, snip your tubing with a sharp pair of scissors. Do not cut your tubing on an angle. You will want a nice flat edge that can reach the base of the valve you're connecting to. I am going to leave this clip up just because it does a good job of showing my process for measuring the tubing. However, I missed a crucial step in this specific clip, and that was I need to run my tubing through my lid before I connect it to the air stone. Connecting your tubing to the valves on the air stone is a tedious process, so having to redo it is a little bit of a bummer, but you'll see what I mean coming up, where you actually have to snake the tubing through the lid before you can have it connect down into your air stone at the bottom of your bucket. As you can probably tell by my facial expression, I've just discovered the mistake I made by connecting my tubing to my air stone before running it through the net pot. I could potentially leave it that way. Unfortunately, it does create a little pinch point in the tubing that would severely reduce the airflow that could reach my air stone. So I went ahead and undid that. I'm running it through my 6-inch net pot. Now with the larger net pot, the holes in it are large enough that you can fit the tubing right through one of the upper holes, and then it would go ahead and connect to your air stone that would rest at the bottom of your bucket there. With the 4-hole lid, or the 4-banger lid as HTG calls it, this one here does have a hole located right in the center of the lid there that will accommodate most of your standard tubing that will fit your air pump. So you can snake that tubing right through that hole and it will nicely connect to your air stone located at the bottom of your bucket there. This enables your lid to sit nice and flush on the surface of your bucket, and it just makes everything look a lot neater when your setup is complete. You can go ahead and finish up the rest of your setup in this manner, whether you're dealing with just one bucket in your setup or 8 to 12 buckets in your setup. You will do the same basic process for each of your buckets. I did alternate my buckets with the 4-banger lid followed by the single pot lid, the 4-banger lid followed by the single pot lid. And in doing so, what I was trying to do is space my plants out as much as possible to encourage as much airflow between those plants as possible. So just try not to connect all of your 4-banger lids together, otherwise your plants will be really densely populated in that section. Once your setup is complete, all of your lids should be able to sit flush on top of the buckets. There shouldn't be any stretching of the tubing, and conversely, there should not be any coiled up tubing or additional tubing that is in excess of the amount that you would need. You really want to get the measurements within 2 to 3 inches of what the actual distance is, just to keep your setup looking nice and neat. Once your setup is complete, we want to start the testing phase where we'll fill up each bucket about 3/4 of the way with water. And what we're doing here is we want to make sure that all of our tubing connections are secure, all of our air stones are in working order, and essentially the entire system is connected properly and will work once you have your nutrient solution in place. Keep in mind when you're doing this testing phase, you only need to do this with regular water right out of the faucet. In case anything doesn't go quite right, you don't want to waste any of those expensive nutrients in the testing phase here. When testing out your air pump, you want to make sure that you can actually see the bubbles. So take your lid and your net pot right off of the bucket so you can see the air come directly out of the stones. If your air pump does have different settings on it, go ahead and test it out at each setting to ensure that everything is working appropriately. If you notice that something isn't quite right, you'll want to contact the manufacturer or return it before you put any plants in there. Typically, once you've got nutrient solution or plants in your buckets, a lot of times it's a lot harder to return some of those items. As long as all of the buckets in your system are working as they should, then you are ready to go ahead and transplant your seedlings into your new hydroponics setup.
My 4 buckets are all set up and ready to go. I've tested all 4 air stones. Everything is working as it should be, and these guys are ready to have plants transplanted into them. Now for the next video in this series, I am going to walk through step by step how I transplant my seedlings into my DWC bucket systems. This is a really simple process that when followed correctly will lead you to really healthy, fast-growing plants in just a couple weeks. If you have any questions regarding my hydroponic bucket setup that I worked on today or anything about growing with the DWC method in hydroponics, please leave them in the comments section below. If you enjoy watching content like this and want to learn more about hydroponics indoor growing, definitely subscribe and alert to this channel so that you know when my next video launches in my hydroponics series. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I sure do appreciate you spending the time with us today, and I hope to catch you next time. Have a great day.